Speaking of neck resets on banjos, are you mostly are are your banjos primarily dowel stick, or are you using rods, or?
So primarily for years they were all dowel stick. The first couple that I made were coordinator rods before I figured out the dowel stick. And really mostly out of, I'd never really seen many banjos. So the ones I had seen had been, coordinator rod banjos. And just up until the end of last year, all of my banjos were dowel stick banjos. And I just recently invented a new neck attachment hardware that I've been using that maintains the traditional look of a dowel stick. It still uses a dowel stick, but the dowel stick is now part of the rim and the neck is bolted on using that hardware. And that's what the holes in the end of this are for. And it's something that there's a number of other open back makers have switched to bolt-on necks and use bolt-on necks, but the way they've essentially done it is using one wooden coordinator rod. The most typical method that you see is two hanger bolts in the neck, like a coordinator rod banjo would have, and then they just make a round dowel stick that screws onto that bottom bolt, and then just a nut on the top one. And I never wanted to switch to that method because, as somebody who repairs a lot of banjos, if you don't support that rim as much as you can, it's just going to do this. And they all do at certain points. But if you don't have support in the middle or the top of that rim, it's just going to want to move and just fold in half.
String tension is pulling it, just like
exactly.
It's trying to turn into a bow and arrow.
Exactly. And the I think one of the first people that I ever saw do that lowered wooden round coordinator rod was Jason Romero, who's a really highly regarded maker and a really amazing banjo maker. And it's been a huge influence and help to me over the years. And I got a banjo mandolin in a trade that he had made. It was one of the early banjo mandolins that he'd made. Somebody traded it to me for a banjo. And right away, when I got it, I said, "Oh, this thing needs a neck reset. It's just imploding on itself because of that low coordinator rod." And the enhanced tension was really the main thing that made it, a 5-string banjo would be able to mostly hold up if the rim is strong enough, but having that extra tension, it just made it an extreme force to just, turn that thing into an egg, essentially. And that's what kind of led me to go, I don't think I want to use that method. I don't think there's enough support that it allows for. That's why Gibson uses 2 coordinator rods mainly. It's adjustability, but it's also for support in that top of the rim. You've got to keep that rim rigid. And I wanted to switch to a bolt-on neck because the set dowel stick banjos, while being a great joint when done correctly and really rigid and strong, there is zero adjustability. There's less and less understanding of that joint, how it works, how to reset it properly, how to maintain it. Even among builders and players alike and repair guys, I've just seen we've all seen the banjos with tons of holes in the back of the rim and people just move the dowel stick up and down. And
So do you pull dowel sticks when you do a neck reset, or?
Yeah, so it depends. When I'm doing a dowel stick neck reset, actually my preferred method is pretty extreme, and it kind of scares some people, but it's a method that I learned from a friend of mine, Andy Fitzgibbon in West Virginia, who works for Bob Smacula, who's a big name in the banjo world, who's restored countless amount of banjos. And I learned this method from him of actually cutting the dowel stick off at the neck and then rebuilding the tenon. And I don't do it for all of them, but essentially what you get into in the vintage banjo world, even in the high end of the early banjos, they're all over the place. Vega is the big name in those of the banjos that have held on the best and the people want work done to the most usually are these old Vega banjos, old white ladies and tubophones, and they were extremely consistent in how they made banjos, except for the way they set their necks and set their dowel sticks. Some dowel sticks are straight, the tenons are straight. Some of them, they end up in different places in the rims. The angles are all different. Essentially, there's no consistencies. You'll find similarities and like, oh, this one's like that one, but this one's not like this one, you know? And when you steam those dowels out, sometimes you find a straight tenon off of the dowel stick, but sometimes you find one that the tenon, more likely you'll find it that the tenon is actually angled to the rest of the plane of the dowel stick. So you end up with this extreme trigonometry problem that's kind of all like mystery numbers in this way. So usually the best way to do those kinds of neck resets are start with a fresh slate, essentially, like cut off the tenon, rebuild that tenon on the end of the dowel stick, plug the holes, and then start with a fresh tenon that you know is straight to a certain plane, and then drill that hole based off your fingerboard plane on whatever angle you need. And with banjos and the way rims warp and things move, there's always that weird gray area that we all run into at times with instruments and wood. But having that kind of understanding of where the math ends up and where things should be, and having control over those elements of like, you know, this tenon's, somebody shaped it with a rasp on the end of this dowel stick. Who knows how round and straight this thing is? Not having that element in there makes for a much more accurate end result.
How crazy do the vintage banjo guys get about flopping a dowel stick off and retenoning it?
You know, I've actually never run into somebody that really cared how the inside of it was done, as long as it looked right in the end and played the way they wanted it to. I'm sure there's some of my friends who are the really high-end collectors, they own banjos that have had this done to them, but generally those guys, they don't even reset the necks. You know, they won't touch it unless it has to be, or unless it's going to be their player banjo, you know. So it really depends, you know, and sometimes it's just necessary because it's, if you want to play it, if you want to keep it alive, this kind of stuff has to be done. And in the banjo world, a lot of, like, for instance, a lot of those Vega banjos, there's a fair number of them that don't have original fingerboards, don't have original peg heads, because they used a lot of pressure dyed wood that just turns to dust, as you know. I know you've seen a lot of that.
Repair wood, a lot of,
yeah, the stuff that you just can't save. You know, you can try, but it'll just fall apart completely. And I work with a number of collectors, but the ones that I do tend to not be too picky about that kind of stuff, because they're also players and they want to play the instruments and they want them to stay alive in a way that people will play them and enjoy them.